Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history, in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In the remote hollers of Pocahontas County, West Virginia, where the morning mist clings to ancient ridgelines like forgotten prayers, there once stood a cabin that the mountain folk spoke of only in whispers. The structure, weathered gray as old bones, perched on a shelf of land carved from the steep hillside, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through dense stands of hemlock and rhododendron. Local records from the 1940s describe it as the residence of Cordelia Netherton, a woman who claimed to be a healer whose reputation stretched across 3 counties, though few who knew her would speak of her methods. The disappearances began in the autumn of 1947, though it would be years before anyone connected the dots. Women from isolated mountain communities, all suffering from various ailments and seeking medical treatment unavailable in their remote settlements, would set out along the familiar mountain paths toward Cordelia's cabin. The trail they followed had been worn smooth by generations of mountain folk seeking remedies for conditions that conventional medicine could not address. Yet somewhere between their homes and that weathered cabin door, some simply vanished. Magistrate records from Pocahontas County contain sparse documentation of these disappearances, filed under various headings that suggest bureaucratic confusion rather than deliberate investigation. A notation from October 1947 mentions Arabella Whitmore, age 28, reported missing en route to receive medical treatment. Another entry, dated 3 weeks later, records the absence of Seraphina Graves, 31 years of age, last seen departing for the high country cabin seeking treatment for chronic pain. The entries become more frequent as winter approached, yet no systematic investigation appears to have been undertaken. The mountain communities of that era operated under their own codes of silence and self-reliance. When Thurston Whitmore reported his wife Arabella missing to the local constable, he was told that healing treatments sometimes required extended stays, and that she would likely return when her treatment was complete. The constable, a man named Dalton Ridley, who had held his position through political appointment rather than any particular qualification for law enforcement, noted in his handwritten log that mountain healing is unpredictable, and suggested that Thurston wait for the treatment to take its course. In those remote settlements, where the nearest physician might be a day's ride away, healers like Cordelia held positions of extraordinary trust and authority. She had provided medical treatments throughout the region for more than 2 decades, earning a reputation for successfully treating conditions that had baffled conventional doctors. Old-timers spoke of her ability to cure ailments that others had given up as hopeless, though they rarely elaborated on her specific methods. A diary fragment discovered years later in the effects of local merchant Ezra Pemberton notes, "Cordelia has a way about her that puts the patients at ease, though I confess there is something in her manner that unsettles me. She speaks of illness and health as though they were merely different states in the same experiment." The Netherton cabin occupied a peculiar position in the local geography, situated in what mountain folk called a saddle between 2 prominent ridges. The location provided shelter from the prevailing winds while offering commanding views of the valleys below. According to a survey conducted by the Civilian Conservation Corps in 1938, the cabin sat at an elevation of approximately 200 feet, accessible only by the single trail that switchbacked up the mountainside through terrain that grew increasingly treacherous as it climbed. The survey notes mention that the property included multiple outbuildings, including what appears to be an unusually large root cellar constructed of native stone. This root cellar would later become central to the investigation, though in 1947 it was simply another unremarkable feature of rural mountain life. Most families maintained similar structures for storing vegetables, preserved foods, and other necessities through the harsh mountain winters. The Netherton Cellar, however, was noted by the CCC survey team as being significantly larger than typical, extending some 30 feet into the hillside and featuring multiple chambers carved from the native limestone. The survey chief, a man named Walter Goss, included a marginal note that the excavation showed professional-level stonework, suggesting construction by someone with advanced masonry skills. The construction of such an elaborate underground facility would have required considerable resources and expertise, far beyond what a typical mountain resident could afford or access. County records from the 1920s show no permits issued for major excavation work on the Netherton property, suggesting that the root cellar had been built without official oversight or documentation. This lack of formal records would later complicate efforts to understand the timeline and purpose of the facility's construction. Local limestone quarry records from the period indicate that unusually large quantities of cut stone had been purchased by an individual identified only as C. Netherton between 1924 and 1926. The quarry foreman's notes, preserved in company files, describe the buyer as an unusual woman who seemed to know exactly what type of stone she needed and how it should be cut. More significantly, the purchases included specialized drainage materials and waterproof sealants typically used in commercial construction projects, rather than residential applications. The mystery deepens when one considers the logistics of transporting such heavy materials up the treacherous mountain trail to Cordelia's property. The quarry is located more than 15 miles from the cabin site, connected only by rough logging roads that would have been barely passable by wagon during the 1920s. Several local residents interviewed decades later recalled seeing heavily loaded wagons making multiple trips up the mountain during that period, but none could explain how such cargo could have been moved efficiently over such difficult terrain. This transportation puzzle led investigators to theorize that Cordelia may have had assistance from individuals with access to specialized equipment or alternative transportation methods. Military surplus records from the period show that several heavy-duty vehicles were sold to private buyers in the region following World War I, though the specific purchasers and intended uses were not documented. It's possible that Cordelia, or those working with her, had acquired such equipment to facilitate the construction of her underground facility. As the harsh winter of 1947-48 settled over the mountains, the number of missing women continued to climb. Octavia Ashworth, wife of local timber cutter Magnus Ashworth, departed for Cordelia's cabin during a December snowstorm seeking treatment for a persistent respiratory condition that had been worsening for months. She never returned. Her husband waited 3 days before venturing up the mountain himself, following the trail through knee-deep snow until he reached the cabin. He found the structure empty, with no sign that anyone had been there recently. The fireplace was cold, and a thin layer of undisturbed snow covered the front porch. Most troubling, Octavia's tracks ended abruptly approximately 50 yards short of the cabin, as though she had simply stepped off the trail and vanished into the surrounding forest. Magnus Ashworth's account, preserved in a letter he wrote to his brother in Kentucky, describes his growing panic as he searched the area around the cabin. The snow was fresh fallen, and I could follow her footsteps clear as day until they just stopped. Not like she turned aside or doubled back, but like she was lifted clean off the ground. I called her name until my voice gave out, but the only answer was the wind in the hemlocks. Found the cabin door unlocked and went inside, thinking maybe Cordelia had taken her to some other place for treatment. But the place felt empty as a tomb. Cordelia's things were all there, but covered with dust like nobody had touched them in weeks. Magnus's search of the cabin revealed additional puzzling details that he included in subsequent letters to his brother. The interior of the structure appeared to have been carefully cleaned and organized, with medical supplies arranged in precise order and personal items positioned as though for display rather than daily use. Most unusual was the discovery of a patient registry book containing the names and dates of visits from women seeking Cordelia's assistance, meticulously maintained with details about each woman's condition and prescribed treatment regimen. The registry, which Magnus had the presence of mind to remove from the cabin and preserve, would later become crucial evidence in the investigation. The entries revealed that Cordelia had been tracking far more patients than anyone in the community had realized, with records dating back several years and including women from counties as distant as 3 days' travel from her cabin. The careful documentation suggested a level of organization and planning that was inconsistent with the casual word-of-mouth referral system typical of rural healing practices. More disturbing still were the notations Cordelia had made beside many of the entries. These margin notes included medical observations written in technical terminology that seemed advanced for a rural healer, as well as cryptic references to treatment protocols and progress measurements. Several entries were marked with symbols that appeared to be some form of coding system, possibly indicating different categories or classifications for the women under her care. The brothers' response to Magnus's letters, also preserved in family papers, revealed additional disturbing information. He wrote back that he had encountered a traveling preacher who mentioned strange stories coming out of the high country about a healer who demanded payment beyond what most folks could afford. The preacher had refused to elaborate, saying only that some prices are too terrible to name in a letter. This reference to unusual payment arrangements would later prove significant when investigators attempted to understand Cordelia's financial resources and connections to outside institutions. Banking records from the period, eventually obtained through a court order issued in 1952, revealed that Cordelia had maintained accounts at multiple financial institutions across 3 states, with regular deposits far exceeding what a rural healer could reasonably earn through traditional practice. The deposits followed a consistent pattern, with larger amounts received quarterly and smaller payments arriving monthly, suggesting some form of contract or institutional arrangement rather than fee-for-service payments from individual patients. The banking records also revealed that Cordelia had made substantial purchases of medical equipment and supplies through companies based in Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Boston. These suppliers specialized in products used by hospitals and research institutions, not rural practitioners. The sophistication of her purchases, combined with the precise timing of her financial transactions, suggested coordination with outside organizations that had specific requirements for equipment and supplies. Local church records from this period show an unusual pattern of prayer requests and memorial services for women who had gone to seek healing, but never returned. Reverend Cornelius Winthrop of the Pine Ridge Methodist Church noted in his pastoral diary that he had received numerous requests from families asking for prayers for their missing relatives, but in many cases the families themselves soon disappeared from the community entirely. A particularly cryptic entry dated January 15, 1948, reads, "Visited the Whitmore homestead today to inquire about the well-being of the family following Arabella's departure for treatment. Found the house abandoned, with evidence that the family departed hastily. Thurston's hunting rifle still hung above the fireplace, and Arabella's personal belongings remained in the wardrobe. Such items are not left behind lightly in times like these." The pattern of sudden family departures became more apparent as Reverend Winthrop continued his pastoral visits throughout the winter. In multiple cases, entire families had vanished from their homes, leaving behind valuable possessions and livestock that would normally be essential for survival through the harsh mountain winter. The Reverend's growing concern is documented in increasingly frequent diary entries, which describe his attempts to understand why so many families would abandon their homes and livelihoods without explanation. The Reverend's investigation revealed that, in several cases, the missing families had received visits from unidentified men in the days following their relatives' departures to seek Cordelia's assistance. Neighbors described these visitors as well-dressed outsiders who arrived in automobiles rather than the horse-drawn vehicles typical of the region. The visitors reportedly offered to purchase the family's properties at prices significantly above market value, with immediate cash payment and no requirement for formal documentation of sale. These property transactions, conducted without legal oversight or registration, effectively erased the families from official records while providing them with substantial financial resources to relocate elsewhere. The pattern suggested a systematic effort to remove witnesses and eliminate evidence of whatever had occurred during the women's visits to Cordelia's cabin. The coordination required for such operations indicated involvement by organizations with significant financial resources and the ability to operate outside normal legal and regulatory frameworks. Reverend Winthrop's growing concern is evident in subsequent diary entries, which document his attempts to organize a search party to investigate the matter more thoroughly. However, these efforts met with consistent resistance from the local population. As he wrote on February 3, 1948, spoke with several men about forming a group to search the high country trails, but was met with reluctance and changing of subject that I find most peculiar. Dalton Ridley became visibly agitated when I pressed the matter, claiming that some things are best left to sort themselves out. Even Magnus Ashworth, who lost his own wife, declined to participate, saying he had already seen enough to last a lifetime. The resistance to investigation that Reverend Winthrop encountered was not limited to fear or superstition. Several community members later confided that they had been visited by the same unidentified outsiders who had approached the missing families. These visits typically involved subtle threats disguised as friendly warnings about the dangers of interfering in matters beyond local understanding. The visitors made it clear that cooperation with any investigation would result in serious consequences for the individuals and their families. The effectiveness of this intimidation campaign became apparent when Reverend Winthrop attempted to contact state authorities about the disappearances. His letters to the governor's office and state police were acknowledged, but never answered, and when he traveled to Charleston to present his concerns in person, he was told that local matters should be handled at the local level, and that outside intervention would not be appropriate without a formal request from county authorities. This bureaucratic stonewalling continued even when the Reverend presented detailed documentation of the disappearances, including copies of the registry he had obtained from Magnus Ashworth and witness statements from community members willing to speak publicly. State officials consistently deflected his concerns, suggesting that the missing families had simply relocated during difficult economic times and that the Reverend's suspicions were unfounded. The winter deepened, and the disappearances continued. Cordelia herself had not been seen in the settlements since early autumn, though smoke was occasionally spotted rising from her cabin chimney, suggesting ongoing occupation. A team of hunters reported seeing lamplight in the windows during a late February expedition, but none were willing to approach the structure directly. Their reticence becomes more understandable when viewed in the context of local folklore, which had begun to accumulate around the Netherton cabin in ways that no amount of rational explanation could dispel. The folklore that developed around Cordelia's activities reflected the community's attempt to process traumatic events that lay beyond their normal experience. Stories began to circulate about strange lights seen moving through the forest at night, unusual sounds echoing from the mountains during the early morning hours, and the persistent odor of chemicals carried on the wind from the direction of the cabin. While these accounts were probably based on actual observations, their retelling gradually incorporated supernatural elements that served to discourage investigation while preserving some memory of the actual events. Elmira Goodwin, an elderly woman who served as the community's unofficial keeper of oral traditions, began documenting stories that had previously been shared only in hushed conversations around winter fires. Her handwritten notes, discovered in 1961 among the papers of her granddaughter, record fragments of testimony that paint a progressively darker picture of Cordelia Netherton's activities. One account, attributed to a woman identified only as MT, describes a disturbing encounter. Went to Cordelia for help with my sister's chronic ailment. Found the old woman changed, speaking in ways that made no sense about perfecting the human form and advancing medical understanding beyond traditional limitations. When I asked about the other women who had come seeking treatment, she smiled in a way that chilled my blood and said they had contributed to a greater purpose and were helping to push the boundaries of medical science. This account, while couched in metaphorical language, provides insight into Cordelia's apparent mental state during the period when the disappearances were occurring. The reference to perfecting the human form suggests that she viewed her activities as part of a larger purpose or mission that transcended individual patient care. The clinical detachment implied in her response indicates a fundamental shift in her understanding of her role and responsibilities as a medical practitioner. Another fragment, this one from a man designated as J.H., provides additional insight into the growing unease surrounding the healer. Saw Cordelia in town last time before the snows came heavy. She was buying supplies, but strange ones, lamp oil, rope, and what looked like medical instruments I'd never seen before. When the store clerk asked about the missing women, she laughed and said they were participating in vital research, like that made any sense at all. Her eyes had gone strange, like she was looking right through you at something nobody else could see. The merchant who served Cordelia during this final visit to town was Ezra Pemberton, whose detailed sales records provide additional insight into her purchasing patterns during the months preceding the investigation. Pemberton's ledger, preserved in the County Historical Society's archives, shows that Cordelia's orders had become increasingly unusual throughout 1947. In addition to standard medical supplies, she had requested large quantities of preservation materials, industrial cleaning compounds, and specialized tools that seemed more appropriate for laboratory work than traditional healing practices. Most significantly, Pemberton's records show that Cordelia had placed special orders for equipment that had to be shipped from suppliers in major cities. These items included precision measuring instruments, chemical storage containers, and what the supplier manifest described as specialized anatomical research materials. The cost of these purchases far exceeded what a rural healer could afford through normal practice, reinforcing the evidence from banking records that Cordelia had access to substantial financial resources from unknown sources. The references to research and advancement, while potentially metaphorical, take on additional significance when considered alongside the discovery that would eventually bring the entire matter to light. In March of 1948, as the snow began to melt and reveal what winter had hidden, a crew of loggers working the lower slopes noticed an unusual pattern in the vegetation around Cordelia's property. Where the snow had melted earliest, patches of earth showed signs of recent disturbance, despite the hard freeze that should have made such excavation impossible during the winter months. Gideon Morse, the crew foreman, initially attributed these irregularities to natural processes, frost heaves, animal activity, or the settling of soil as temperatures fluctuated. However, as more snow melted, the pattern became increasingly difficult to explain through natural means. Long, narrow depressions in the earth radiated outward from the area near the cabin's root cellar, as though something had been dragged repeatedly along the same paths. More disturbing still, these depressions appeared to connect with a series of small mounds that dotted the landscape in what seemed almost like a deliberate arrangement. The systematic nature of these ground disturbances suggested careful planning and organization rather than random activity. The depressions were approximately uniform in width and depth, indicating that whatever had been dragged along them was similar in size and weight. The spacing between the mounds followed a regular pattern that suggested deliberate placement according to some predetermined plan or protocol. Gideon's crew also noticed that the disturbed areas were concentrated in locations that would not be visible from the main trail or from any of the surrounding ridgelines. This positioning indicated that whoever had created these disturbances had taken care to conceal their activities from casual observation. The tactical awareness required for such concealment suggested military or intelligence training rather than the skills of a typical rural resident. The discovery that would transform the investigation from a missing persons inquiry into something far more serious came on March 18, 1948, when Gideon's crew was surveying timber stands near the cabin site. One of the loggers, a young man named Fletcher Sims, noticed what appeared to be fabric protruding from one of the mysterious mounds. Upon closer examination, the fabric proved to be a piece of winter coat that matched the description of clothing worn by Octavia Ashworth when she had last been seen alive. Fletcher's account, recorded in a sworn statement given to Magistrate William Frost 3 days later, describes his growing horror as the implications became clear. Soon as I saw that bit of wool cloth, I knew something terrible had happened. Called to Gideon, and we started carefully moving the earth with our hands. Wasn't more than a foot down when we found her, poor soul, wrapped tight in some kind of canvas or oiled cloth, like someone had taken great care to preserve her. But the most awful part was her condition. She looked like she'd been laid to rest recent, not like someone who'd been in the ground all winter long. The preservation of Octavia's remains was indeed remarkable, considering that she had been buried for several months in conditions that should have resulted in significant decomposition. The wrapping materials were later identified as military surplus tarps that had been treated with chemical preservatives commonly used in medical and research applications. The precision with which the body had been prepared and positioned indicated knowledge of embalming techniques far beyond what a rural healer would typically possess. More disturbing still was the discovery that Octavia's body had been subjected to what appeared to be surgical procedures performed either during or shortly after her death. Dr. Harrison Caldwell, who conducted the initial examination, noted incisions and sutures that indicated post-mortem medical intervention of unknown purpose. The skill level demonstrated in these procedures was consistent with advanced surgical training, reinforcing the evidence that Cordelia possessed medical knowledge far beyond her claimed background. The discovery of Octavia Ashworth's remains prompted Magistrate Frost to authorize a full investigation of the Netherton property, though by the time officials arrived at the cabin, Cordelia herself had vanished as completely as her former patients. The structure stood empty, showing no signs of recent habitation despite the smoke that witnesses had reported throughout the winter months. All of Cordelia's personal possessions remained in place, including medical supplies and treatment equipment, but the woman herself was nowhere to be found. The condition of the abandoned cabin provided additional clues about the nature of Cordelia's activities and her connection to outside organizations. The medical equipment found in the structure was far more sophisticated than anything available through normal commercial channels in rural West Virginia during the 1940s. Several items bore manufacturer markings indicating they had been produced for government or military use, with serial numbers that suggested official procurement rather than private purchase. An inventory conducted by federal investigators who arrived shortly after the local authorities included items such as precision surgical instruments, chemical analysis equipment, and specimen preservation materials that would have been restricted to research institutions and government laboratories. The presence of such equipment in a remote mountain cabin raised obvious questions about how Cordelia had obtained these materials and what purposes they had served in her practice. The investigation of the root cellar revealed construction far more elaborate than anything suggested by previous descriptions. The structure extended approximately 40 feet into the mountainside, with multiple chambers connected by narrow passages carved through solid limestone. The walls showed evidence of careful planning and skilled execution, with fitted stonework that would have required considerable time and expertise to complete. Most significantly, several of the chambers contained what appeared to be specially constructed alcoves, each designed to accommodate a human form. The engineering sophistication of the underground facility was remarkable for its time and location. The excavation had been designed with proper drainage systems, ventilation shafts, and structural supports that demonstrated advanced knowledge of underground construction techniques. The precision of the stonework and the complexity of the chamber layout suggested involvement by professionally trained engineers and masons, rather than local craftsmen working from improvised plans. Federal engineers who examined the structure noted that the construction techniques and materials were consistent with military bunker specifications used during World War II. The ventilation system incorporated air filtration components that were typically used in chemical defense installations, while the drainage system included features designed to contain and neutralize hazardous materials. These elements suggested that the facility had been designed for purposes that involved potentially dangerous chemical or biological materials. The chambers themselves were arranged according to a systematic plan that maximized both security and operational efficiency. The main chamber served as a surgical suite with specialized lighting, equipment mounting points, and drainage systems designed for medical procedures. Secondary chambers appeared to function as preparation areas, storage facilities, and what could only be described as holding areas equipped with restraint systems and monitoring equipment. Dr. Harrison Caldwell, a physician from Lewisburg who was brought in to examine the remains, filed a report that raised more questions than it answered. His findings, preserved in county medical records, indicate that Octavia Ashworth had died from what appeared to be complications arising from experimental medical procedures, but her body showed signs of deliberate post-mortem manipulation that he was unable to explain adequately. The examination revealed that she had been subjected to treatments that had no apparent therapeutic purpose. Dr. Caldwell's detailed autopsy report, initially classified due to its disturbing contents, was declassified in 1965 following a federal court order. The document reveals that Octavia had been subjected to multiple experimental procedures both before and after her death, including techniques that had no apparent medical justification. The precision and sophistication of these procedures indicated that they had been performed by individuals with advanced surgical training working under controlled laboratory conditions. Perhaps most troubling were Dr. Caldwell's findings regarding the timing and sequence of the various interventions. His analysis indicated that some procedures had been performed while Octavia was still alive, but under heavy anesthesia, while others occurred after her death, but before the onset of decomposition. This timeline suggested that her death had been anticipated and planned, with preparations made to maximize the scientific value of the post-mortem procedures. The systematic excavation that followed revealed 5 additional burial sites, each containing the remains of women who had disappeared over the course of the previous winter seeking medical treatment. Like Octavia, each woman appeared to have died during experimental procedures, and each had been carefully prepared and interred with what investigators described as scientific precision. The bodies were wrapped in oiled canvas and positioned in identical poses, hands folded across the chest, with small personal items arranged around each form. The consistency of the burial arrangements indicated that all 6 women had been processed according to the same protocol. suggesting standardized procedures developed through practice and refinement. The personal items found with each body had been carefully selected and positioned, apparently as part of some documentation or identification system, rather than for sentimental reasons. Each woman's possessions included items that would have been valuable for determining identity, medical history, or family connections. However, the investigation raised fundamental questions that would never be satisfactorily answered. Despite clear evidence that all 6 women had been subjected to extensive experimental procedures, the specific objectives and outcomes of these experiments remained unclear. Dr. Caldwell noted in his supplementary report that the medical evidence presents systematic experimental protocols that cannot be adequately explained through conventional therapeutic analysis. The apparent randomness of the procedures suggested that they were conducted for research purposes rather than treatment objectives. The mystery deepened when investigators attempted to trace Cordelia Netherton's background and establish how she had acquired the advanced medical knowledge and surgical skills evident in her practice. County records indicated that she had appeared in the area sometime around 1925, claiming to have learned healing practices from her grandmother, but no documentation existed to support this claim. Inquiries to neighboring counties and states produced no record of any woman matching her description having received formal medical training or certification. Background investigations conducted by federal agencies revealed that the identity, Cordelia Netherton, appeared to be completely fabricated. No birth records, family documentation, or educational credentials could be found for anyone by that name, matching her physical description and approximate age. Immigration records showed no entry into the United States by anyone with those identifying characteristics, and census data contained no previous entries for such an individual in any of the surrounding states. The fabricated identity suggested that Cordelia was operating under official cover, with her background and documentation provided by government agencies for operational security purposes. The sophistication of her false identity indicated access to resources and expertise typically available only to intelligence or military organizations. This revelation transformed the investigation from a local criminal matter into a potential case involving classified government operations. Even more puzzling was the discovery, in a concealed compartment within the root cellar, of medical instruments and surgical implements far more sophisticated than anything a rural healer would typically possess. Caldwell's inventory includes items that he described as surgical tools of unusual design, some appearing to be modifications of standard instruments for purposes I cannot readily determine. Among these items was a leather-bound journal containing detailed anatomical drawings and what appeared to be technical notations written in a mixture of English and symbols that experts from the University of Virginia were unable to decipher. The surgical instruments found in Cordelia's possession were subsequently analyzed by specialists at Johns Hopkins Medical School, who determined that many of the items were prototypes or experimental designs not available through normal commercial channels. Several instruments bore markings indicating they had been manufactured specifically for research purposes, with features optimized for procedures that had no standard medical applications. The presence of such specialized equipment reinforced the evidence that Cordelia was involved in experimental research rather than traditional medical practice. The journal's contents, as far as could be determined, documented a series of procedures that bore little resemblance to conventional medical treatments. The drawings showed human anatomical structures, but with modifications and augmentations that suggested experimentation beyond the scope of normal therapeutic intervention. Marginal notes in Cordelia's handwriting included references to biological optimization protocols and specimen preparation for analysis, terminology that seemed to indicate purposes far removed from healing or treatment. Cryptographers from the War Department were brought in to analyze the coded portions of Cordelia's journal, but their efforts yielded only fragmentary results. The symbols appeared to be based on a combination of medical terminology, chemical formulas, and what seemed to be classification codes used by military research facilities. The complexity and consistency of the coding system indicated that Cordelia was communicating with other individuals who shared her specialized knowledge and operational procedures. A particularly disturbing section of the journal, translated by Latin scholars from Washington and Lee University, contained what appeared to be a systematic catalog of physical characteristics and measurements for each of the missing women. Heights, weights, blood types, and other details were recorded with scientific precision, along with notations about experimental compatibility factors and optimal timing for procedures. The scholars noted that the language used was highly technical and suggests advanced knowledge of human anatomy and experimental physiology that would be unusual for someone without formal medical education. The catalog entries also included detailed medical histories for each woman, with information that could not have been obtained through casual observation or normal clinical examination. The records included genetic markers, blood chemistry data, and physiological measurements that would have required sophisticated laboratory analysis to determine. The source of such detailed medical information was never established, but its presence suggested that Cordelia had access to comprehensive health records for the entire regional population. The investigation expanded to include interviews with family members and acquaintances of all the missing women, revealing a pattern that had not been immediately apparent. Each woman had been suffering from chronic medical conditions that had proven resistant to conventional treatment methods. Several families mentioned that Cordelia had specifically sought them out, rather than being contacted for assistance. Magnus Ashworth recalled that Cordelia had arrived at their home uninvited, claiming she had heard about Octavia's condition, and offering her revolutionary treatment methods free of charge. Similar accounts emerged from other families. Thurston Whitmore reported that Cordelia had appeared at their door on a snowy evening, insisting that Arabella could benefit from experimental treatments that only she could provide. The healer had been unusually persistent, returning multiple times and growing increasingly insistent that delay would result in the progression of Arabella's condition beyond any hope of intervention. Other families described identical experiences, with Cordelia demonstrating detailed knowledge of medical conditions that the women themselves had not shared with anyone outside their immediate families. This pattern of behavior suggested a level of medical surveillance that raised troubling questions about Cordelia's methods and motivations. Dr. Caldwell speculated in his final report that the subject appears to have been systematically identifying women whose medical conditions presented specific research opportunities, then deliberately targeting these individuals for experimental intervention. The question of how she had acquired such detailed medical information about private family matters was never resolved. The systematic targeting of women with specific medical complications suggested that Cordelia was operating according to research protocols designed to study particular aspects of human physiology or medical intervention. The selection criteria appeared to focus on cases that would provide the greatest scientific value while targeting individuals whose disappearances might be explained as natural progression of their existing medical conditions. This approach would maximize the availability of research subjects while reducing the likelihood of investigation. Federal investigators eventually determined that Cordelia had been monitoring the health of women throughout the region through a network of informants that included local merchants, postal workers, and even some medical practitioners. This surveillance system allowed her to identify suitable subjects well in advance and to develop detailed intervention plans based on their specific medical conditions and family circumstances. The search for Cordelia herself expanded to include neighboring states and territories, But despite extensive efforts by both local law enforcement and federal marshals, no trace of the healer was ever discovered. Her disappearance appeared to have been as carefully planned as her medical procedures, with no evidence left behind to indicate her destination or intended refuge. The investigation gradually lost momentum as other cases demanded attention and resources, and by 1950, the active search had been quietly discontinued. The thoroughness of Cordelia's disappearance suggested advanced planning and outside assistance from individuals with professional training in covert operations. No personal belongings were missing from her cabin, but careful analysis revealed that specific items had been removed, primarily documents, photographs, and equipment that might have provided clues about her true identity or operational connections. The selection of materials removed indicated familiarity with intelligence gathering and evidence elimination procedures. Subsequent investigation revealed that Cordelia's disappearance had been coordinated with similar evacuations of personnel from research facilities in multiple states. Federal records, declassified decades later, show that several classified programs were terminated in 1948 following security concerns and congressional inquiries into unauthorized medical research. The timing of these program closures coincided exactly with Cordelia's disappearance, suggesting that she had been extracted as part of a larger effort to protect classified operations from public exposure. However, the case took an unexpected turn in 1953 when a traveling minister named Reverend Josiah Wainwright reported a strange encounter during a preaching circuit through the remote areas of Virginia and Kentucky. According to his written testimony, submitted to authorities in Richmond, he had encountered a woman matching Cordelia's description operating under a different name in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. She was reportedly providing medical services to isolated communities, but several families he spoke with mentioned troubling experiences, similar to those documented in West Virginia. Reverend Wainwright's account describes a brief conversation with the woman, during which she exhibited detailed knowledge of experimental medical procedures and spoke about her work in terms that made him deeply uncomfortable. She discussed human health and disease as though they were merely variables in a larger experiment, he wrote, and made references to advancing medical understanding through practical research and optimizing human biological function that seemed inconsistent with normal healing practices. When I inquired about her training and credentials, she became evasive and soon departed the area entirely. The woman Reverend Wainwright encountered was operating under the name Constance Norton and had established herself in the remote community of Harlan County, Kentucky, where she had been providing medical services for approximately 2 years. Local residents described her as highly competent but unusual in her methods and approach to patient care. Several families reported that she had demonstrated knowledge of their medical histories and family circumstances that seemed impossible for an outsider to have obtained through normal means. Attempts to follow up on this lead proved unsuccessful. By the time investigators reached the Kentucky settlements mentioned by Reverend Wainwright, the woman had vanished, leaving behind only fragmentary accounts from local residents who described experiences remarkably similar to those reported in West Virginia. The pattern of targeting women with complicated medical conditions, providing experimental treatments under unusual circumstances, and subsequently disappearing without explanation had apparently been repeated in multiple locations. The ease with which Constance Norton had integrated into the Kentucky community and subsequently disappeared suggested that she was part of an organized network with established procedures for establishing and abandoning operational identities. The consistency of her methods across different locations indicated that she was following standardized protocols developed through extensive experience and training. Federal investigators eventually identified at least 6 different locations where women matching Cordelia's description had operated under various identities between 1948 and 1955. These operations followed similar patterns, with each healer establishing herself in an isolated rural community, targeting women with specific medical complications, and disappearing after approximately 2 years of activity. The geographic distribution of these operations suggested a coordinated program involving multiple personnel operating according to shared objectives and procedures. The most disturbing aspect of these reports was the consistency with which witnesses described the woman's demeanor and methods. Multiple accounts mentioned her unusual interest in what she called biological optimization and her tendency to discuss human health in clinical, almost scientific terms that seemed inappropriate for a traditional healer. Several families reported that she had attempted to convince them to allow their relatives to participate in advanced treatment protocols for what she described as cutting-edge medical research. These requests for participation in advanced treatments appeared to be central to the operations conducted by Cordelia and her associates. Families who agreed to these treatments were provided with substantial financial compensation and were often relocated to other areas shortly afterward. Those who refused found themselves subjected to increasing pressure from local authorities and community members who seemed to be coordinating their efforts to encourage cooperation. The systematic nature of this pressure campaign indicated that the healer operations were supported by larger organizations with the resources and influence necessary to manipulate local officials and community leaders. The coordination required for such campaigns suggested involvement by government agencies or military organizations with established networks of contacts and operatives throughout rural areas. Dr. Patricia Holloway, a researcher studying rural medical practices for her dissertation at Johns Hopkins University, obtained permission in 1961 to examine the sealed records and physical evidence from the Netherton case. Dr. Holloway's academic background in both medicine and anthropology provided a unique perspective on the case, and her analysis revealed several previously overlooked elements that suggested the scope of Cordelia's activities may have been far broader than originally suspected. Dr. Holloway's research uncovered correspondence between Cordelia and several institutions, including medical schools, research hospitals, and pharmaceutical companies. The letters, written under various aliases, discussed topics related to experimental medicine, surgical techniques, and what appeared to be research protocols involving human subjects. While the specific content of these communications was often coded or deliberately vague, the overall pattern suggested that Cordelia had been part of a larger network of individuals involved in unauthorized medical research. The correspondence revealed that Cordelia's operations were part of a multi-institutional research program investigating advanced techniques for studying human physiological responses to experimental interventions. The program appeared to involve cooperation between military research facilities, pharmaceutical companies, and academic institutions, with Cordelia serving as a field operative responsible for obtaining research subjects from isolated rural populations where oversight and regulation were minimal. Perhaps most significantly, Dr. Holloway discovered evidence that Cordelia had maintained detailed records of her procedures far beyond what was found in the Root Cellar journal. References in her correspondence indicated the existence of additional documentation that had been systematically removed from the cabin before the official investigation began. These missing records apparently contained detailed procedural notes, outcomes data, and what one letter described as physiological response analysis of experimental subjects. The missing documentation represented a comprehensive database of experimental procedures conducted over multiple years involving dozens of subjects. The systematic removal of this material indicated that the research program had produced significant scientific data that was considered valuable enough to warrant the risks associated with evidence destruction and cover-up activities. The scope and sophistication of the documentation suggested that Cordelia's operations were producing results that were being analyzed and applied by research institutions at the highest levels of the scientific establishment. The terminology used in these communications was consistently clinical and dehumanizing, referring to the women as research subjects or experimental specimens, and their medical conditions as research opportunities or physiological variables. Dr. Holloway's analysis suggested that Cordelia's activities were not random acts of violence, but rather components of a systematic program designed to study human responses to experimental medical interventions for purposes that remained unclear. The dehumanizing language used throughout the correspondence indicated that the research program operated according to ethical standards far removed from conventional medical practice. The women targeted by Cordelia and her associates were viewed primarily as sources of research data rather than patients deserving of care and protection. This perspective was consistent with research programs conducted during wartime conditions, where normal ethical constraints were suspended in favor of scientific and military objectives. Dr. Holloway's investigation was abruptly terminated in 1962 when she reported receiving anonymous threats warning her to discontinue her research. Her dissertation, originally intended to focus on the Netherton case, was hastily rewritten to address less controversial aspects of rural medical practices. In her private notes, later discovered among her papers following her death in 1985, she wrote, "The more I learned about Cordelia Netherton, the more convinced I became that she was not working alone. The sophistication of her methods, the precision of her procedures, and the apparent coordination with outside institutions suggests involvement in something far larger and more organized than a simple case of individual criminal behavior." The threats that forced Dr. Holloway to abandon her research were delivered through multiple channels, indicating that those responsible had access to detailed information about her activities and contacts. The coordination and timing of these threats suggested that her investigation was being monitored by individuals with professional training in surveillance and intimidation techniques. The effectiveness of the campaign to silence her research indicated that powerful interests remained committed to protecting the secrets of the Netherton case decades after the original events. The abandoned Netherton cabin gradually fell into ruin as local residents avoided the area and made no attempt to reclaim or repurpose the property. By the 1960s, the structure had partially collapsed, and the dense mountain vegetation had begun to reclaim the site. The root cellar, however, remained largely intact, its stone construction proving more durable than the wooden cabin above. Occasional hikers and hunters reported strange experiences in the area, unusual sounds echoing from underground, the persistent odor of antiseptic chemicals despite years of abandonment, and an unsettling sense of being observed while passing through the vicinity. The persistence of chemical odors at the abandoned site suggested that hazardous materials remained in the underground chambers, possibly including preservatives, laboratory reagents, or biological specimens that had been abandoned when the facility was evacuated. The environmental contamination posed potential health risks to anyone who might gain access to the underground areas, but no official assessment or cleanup was ever conducted. Local wildlife patterns also changed following the abandonment of the Netherton property. Hunters reported that game animals consistently avoided the area around the former cabin, while domestic animals showed signs of distress when brought near the site. These behavioral changes suggested that environmental contamination or other hazards were detectable by animal senses even when not apparent to humans. In 1967, a group of geology students from West Virginia University conducted a survey of limestone formations in the region and included the former Netherton property in their study. Their report, filed with the university's Earth Sciences Department, noted several unusual features in the underground structure that had not been documented during the original investigation. Ground-penetrating radar revealed additional chambers and passages extending deeper into the mountainside than had been previously known, suggesting that the excavation was far more extensive than surface examination had indicated. The geology survey revealed that the underground complex extended approximately 200 feet into the mountain, with multiple levels connected by spiral passages that descended to depths of more than 40 feet below the main floor. The complexity of the excavation was remarkable for a facility supposedly constructed by a single individual using primitive tools and techniques. The engineering sophistication suggested involvement by professional mining or construction crews working according to detailed architectural plans. The students' findings were particularly interesting because they revealed evidence of ongoing geological activity in the area. Seismic monitoring detected regular vibrations emanating from deep within the mountain, with patterns too consistent to be attributed to natural causes. The lead researcher, Professor Vincent Crandall, noted in his preliminary report that the subsurface activity appears to be mechanically generated, suggesting the presence of equipment or machinery operating at considerable depth within the limestone formation. The mechanical vibrations detected by the seismic equipment followed patterns consistent with electrical generators, ventilation systems, or other machinery designed for continuous operation. The regularity and persistence of these signals indicated that active equipment remained operational in the deeper levels of the complex, despite the apparent abandonment of the surface facilities more than 20 years earlier. Attempts to explore these deeper levels were abandoned after 2 graduate students became seriously ill during their underground survey work. Both students experienced similar symptoms: severe respiratory distress, disorientation, and what medical examiners described as chemical exposure consistent with prolonged contact with preservative compounds. The students recovered after several weeks of treatment, but both reported persistent nightmares involving underground laboratories and the sound of machinery operating in darkness. The chemical exposure experienced by the students was consistent with inhalation of formaldehyde, phenol, and other preservatives commonly used in laboratory and medical applications. The concentration levels detected in their blood indicated exposure to amounts that would be dangerous even with protective equipment, suggesting that the underground chambers contained substantial quantities of hazardous materials that had accumulated over years of research activity. Professor Crandall's final report, submitted to university administrators in early 1968, recommended that the site be declared permanently off-limits to further academic research. His conclusions stated that the geological instability of the formation, combined with evidence of chemical contamination and potential structural hazards, presents an unacceptable risk to personnel safety. The report was classified and sealed by university administrators, officially due to concerns about liability, but Professor Crandall later confided to colleagues that he suspected other motivations for the secrecy. The professor's suspicions seemed validated when he attempted to publish his findings in academic journals, only to have his papers rejected repeatedly despite their apparent scientific merit. Colleagues reported that Crandall became increasingly paranoid about his research, claiming that his office had been searched and that certain documents had disappeared from his files. In a letter to a friend at Virginia Tech, dated March 1968, Crandall wrote, "I'm beginning to understand why Dr. Holloway terminated her research so abruptly. There are forces at work here that extend far beyond academic interest or scientific curiosity. Eerie." The pattern of intimidation that Professor Crandall experienced was consistent with other attempts to investigate the Netherton case. Researchers who approached too closely to sensitive aspects of the case consistently found themselves facing professional obstacles, personal harassment, and sometimes direct threats to their safety. The coordination and persistence of these campaigns suggested that powerful interests remained committed to protecting the secrets of the underground complex. The last documented official activity at the former Netherton property occurred in 1969, when federal agents conducted what was described as an environmental assessment of the site. Local residents reported seeing unmarked vehicles and personnel in protective equipment working in the area for several weeks, though no public explanation was provided for their presence. The assessment team appeared to focus primarily on the root cellar and the surrounding underground formations, with particular attention paid to areas identified by the geology students' survey. The federal assessment team brought sophisticated equipment, including chemical detection instruments, radiation monitors, and what appeared to be specialized excavation tools designed for hazardous material recovery. The scale and duration of their operations suggested that they were conducting a comprehensive evaluation of the underground complex rather than a routine environmental survey. The use of protective equipment and decontamination procedures indicated that they were dealing with materials that posed significant health and safety risks. Following their departure, the access trail to the cabin site was permanently blocked, and warning signs were posted declaring the area hazardous due to unstable geological conditions. However, the installation of these barriers did not end reports of unusual activity in the region. Throughout the 1970s and beyond, hunters, hikers, and local residents continued to describe strange phenomena associated with the former Netherton property. The official closure of the site was accompanied by the installation of monitoring equipment that remained active for several years following the federal assessment. Local residents reported seeing technicians servicing electronic devices hidden in the forest around the former cabin location, suggesting that ongoing surveillance was being conducted despite the apparent abandonment of the site. Sounds of mechanical operation could sometimes be heard echoing from beneath the mountain, particularly during the winter months when atmospheric conditions might carry underground noises to the surface. More troubling were occasional reports of smoke or vapor emissions from fissures in the limestone, despite the absence of any known geothermal activity in the area. Chemical analysis of these emissions, conducted secretly by concerned residents, revealed the presence of industrial preservatives and laboratory compounds that had no natural explanation. The persistence of chemical emissions decades after the abandonment of the surface facilities indicated that active processes continued in the deeper levels of the complex. The compounds detected in atmospheric samples were consistent with ongoing preservation activities and laboratory operations, suggesting that research work might have continued in hidden facilities that were not discovered during the official investigation. A particularly detailed account comes from a hunting party that camped near the site in October 1974. The group's leader, an experienced outdoorsman named Caleb Morrison, kept a detailed log of their expedition that includes several days of observations near the former cabin location. Morrison noted that during the pre-dawn hours, a distinct humming sound could be heard emanating from the ground, accompanied by what he described as a chemical odor that made breathing difficult and caused our eyes to water. Most unsettling, the hunting party's dogs refused to approach certain areas of the site, displaying signs of extreme agitation and fear that persisted throughout their stay. The dogs' behavior was particularly significant because Morrison had brought the same pack on numerous hunting expeditions over many years, and they had never previously shown such consistent, fearful responses to any location. When forced to approach the block trail leading to the cabin site, the animals would cower and whimper, behavior that Morrison described as like they could sense something that wasn't meant to be in this world. The hunting party cut their expedition short after 3 days, despite having planned a week-long trip. Morrison's final log entry reads, "Whatever happened in this place, whatever Cordelia Netherton was doing here, it left a mark that goes deeper than just the physical evidence. The land itself feels wrong, poisoned somehow. I've hunted these mountains for 40 years and I've never encountered anything like this. We're leaving at first light, and I don't plan to come back. Morrison's observations were consistent with reports from other visitors to the site over the years. The combination of chemical contamination, ongoing mechanical activity, and environmental disturbance had created conditions that were detectable by both human senses and animal instincts. The persistence of these conditions, decades after the apparent cessation of surface activities, suggested that whatever had been accomplished at the site had permanent effects on the local environment. Local folklore has gradually absorbed and transformed the historical facts of the Netherton case, creating a mythology that reflects the community's ongoing discomfort with the unresolved questions surrounding the events. The stories serve both to preserve the memory of the actual crimes and to provide psychological distance from their more disturbing implications. Yet beneath the folklore lies a persistent current of genuine fear, rooted in the recognition that fundamental questions about the case were never answered. The transformation of the Netherton case into local legend represents a natural psychological response to traumatic events that resist rational explanation or official resolution. The mythological elements that have accumulated around the case serve to preserve essential truths about what occurred while providing a framework that allows community members to discuss and process these events without confronting their full implications. The fate of Cordelia Netherton herself remains unknown. The purpose behind her systematic collection of women seeking medical treatment was never fully established. The extent of her connections to outside institutions and individuals was never completely investigated. Most troubling of all, the evidence suggests that her activities may have represented only one component of a larger operation that extended far beyond the isolated cabin in the West Virginia mountains. The systematic suppression of information about the Netherton case suggests that whatever was accomplished through Cordelia's operations was considered valuable enough to warrant decades of cover-up activities involving multiple government agencies and institutions. The persistence of secrecy surrounding the case indicates that the research objectives that motivated the original operations may still be considered sensitive, or that the methods employed were deemed too controversial to acknowledge publicly. In the decade since the official investigation was closed, several independent researchers have attempted to piece together additional information about the case, but their efforts have been consistently hampered by missing documentation, sealed records, and the apparent reluctance of surviving witnesses to discuss their experiences publicly. The pattern of official secrecy and institutional cover-up that began with the initial investigation has persisted, creating a wall of silence around the case that seems designed to prevent rather than encourage further inquiry. The consistency with which attempts at investigation have been frustrated suggests that powerful interests remain committed to protecting the secrets of the Netherton case. The resources required to maintain such comprehensive secrecy for so many decades indicate involvement by institutions with substantial influence and long-term operational capabilities. Perhaps most telling is the fact that, despite the passage of more than 70 years, the former Netherton property remains officially restricted, with access controlled by federal authorities whose specific mandate and objectives are not publicly disclosed. Environmental monitoring equipment has been observed at the site, suggesting ongoing concerns about contamination or other hazards, but no information about the nature of these concerns has been made available to local residents or public health officials. The continued restriction of the site decades after the original events suggests that whatever was accomplished there remains relevant to current government operations or research programs. The persistent monitoring and security measures indicate that the site retains strategic value or contains materials that are considered too dangerous or sensitive for public access. The case of Cordelia Netherton and the missing women of Pocahontas County stands as a reminder that not all crimes are committed by isolated individuals acting alone. Sometimes the most terrible secrets are protected by institutions powerful enough to rewrite history and silence those who would speak the truth. In the remote hollers of Appalachia, where ancient mountains keep their secrets as closely as their coal, the truth about what happened in that root cellar may remain buried forever, along with the women whose only crime was seeking help in their most vulnerable hour. The mountain remembers, even when the people choose to forget. And in the depths where federal barriers guard against unwanted visitors and monitoring equipment maintains its silent vigil, something may still be waiting, patient as stone, for the chance to continue work that was never meant to end. The trail that once led desperate women to seek healing in the high country remains, though it is now blocked by official warnings and federal restrictions. But in the Appalachian Mountains, some paths never truly close, no matter how many barriers are placed across them. The echo of footsteps on that ancient trail may still be heard by those who listen carefully enough, carrying with them the whispered promise that some doors, once opened, remain forever accessible to those who know the right way to approach them. And sometimes, in the depths of winter, when the mist hangs thick among the hemlocks and the federal monitors record their silent data, new footprints have been found in the snow, leading up the mountain toward something that officially no longer exists, but which may be patiently waiting for the next seeker to discover that the old ways of finding help in desperate times have never truly been abandoned.